Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. Thanks for being here on this beautiful Lord's Day morning as we join together for some Bible study. We're studying in the book of Galatians, and we're at chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2 is where we pick up our study this morning. Just by way of quick review, we remember that Paul is going to be dealing with the doctrinal issue of the Judaizers trying to force Gentile converts to observe portions of the law. In particular, the big thing, of course, was circumcision. And so that's going to be a principal doctrinal issue that Paul's going to be addressing in the book of Galatians. But here initially in chapters 1 and entering into chapter 2, he's having to defend his apostleship because the people who opposed him doctrinally attacked his authority to even be speaking as an inspired apostle. That's kind of typical. If a person can't answer an argument or doesn't have a good standing or good basis to oppose an argument, what always happens? Attack the man, right? We even call that an ad hominem attack. In other words, you can't answer the argument, so you attack the man making the argument. That happens in politics in our time just every day. I mean, it's just continuous that you see that sort of thing. It happens religiously. It's not new. It's been going on for a long time. And that's basically what Paul was having to deal with. And so as we were studying through chapter 1, he was defending his apostleship and especially defending the fact that what he was preaching and teaching, he did not learn from other people, but it was by revelation from the Lord. And so he's making that case. He's making his case that he is not just reciting something that was passed down to him, but that he's actually telling what was revealed to him by the Lord. Here in chapter 2, he's continuing that idea of his independence. He's not depending on others to tell him what to teach, and he's giving evidence of that. He's providing proof of his independence in that regard. Tom?
Just also, he received that revelation from Jesus, but it wasn't anything different than what the other apostles had received as well. So if he'd come through and said, I received this from Jesus, but here, it's not what Peter and John, those others teaching, it's something new. I've got a better revelation. He didn't do that.
The Lord revealed to me better stuff than he did to Paul anyway. To Peter anyway. He revealed stuff to me that's better than what he revealed to Peter. I want you to ignore Peter and listen to me. He wasn't saying that.
But that's what people in today's religious movement do. I've got a new revelation, and it circumvents everything that the apostles said.
Yeah. All right, so as we move into chapter 2, still in that same context now, we talked about the first verses. We'll just repeat from chapter 2, verse 1. Then 14 years after. So again, keep in mind the context of this. He's defending the fact that what he's teaching he didn't learn from others. He said that he went briefly, in the previous chapter, he went briefly just for a few days to Jerusalem after he left. He was converted in Damascus. After some time he returned to Jerusalem, but he only stayed there very briefly. And so now he says, it was actually 14 years later before I went up there again. He said, at least went up there to see the apostles. He says in chapter 2, verse 1, Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. And I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. All right, let's stop there for a minute. We talked about the 14-year question. He had actually been there previous to that, but probably had not seen the apostles. In Acts chapter 11, he and Barnabas had carried benevolent gifts from Antioch in Syria. They had carried benevolent gifts, but they delivered them to the elders of the churches of Judea. There's no indication that he saw the apostles or had any interaction with them there. So he's basically saying, after that initial few days that I spent in Jerusalem when I returned from Damascus, It was really 14 years later before I ever went up there and had any interaction with the apostles at all. I think a really important part of this discussion is the first phrase in verse 2. I went up by revelation. Some people want to suggest that meeting, so what he's going to be describing here is the meeting that is recorded in Acts chapter 15. There's big controversy about circumcision. In fact, some false teachers had gone from Jerusalem up to Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas were, and they were trying to spread this false doctrine. Gentile converts have to be circumcised. Paul wasn't going to put up with that. He knew better. He knew better by revelation. And so he and Barnabas and some others went to Jerusalem. They didn't go down there to decide this question. Sometimes you hear this referred to as the Jerusalem Conference. And the idea of that is that they went up there, put their heads together, and they voted on a solution to the problem. And that is not at all what happened. The answer to this problem was already known before Peter went. I keep confusing Peter and Paul. The answer to the question was already known before Paul went. Notice he says there, I went up by revelation. He did not, notice what he didn't say is, I went up there to get an answer to this. I went up there to get those guys to figure out what I should be teaching. He didn't do that. He said, I went up by revelation. Wait.
He also says there in verse 5, but we did not yield and subject to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel might be made.
Yeah, that's going to be a really important statement too in verse 5. Exactly right. But I really do think that we have to, because you will from time to time in talking to people, all of our denominational friends, for instance, they have their conferences and their synods and they have their annual meetings and they actually vote on things. A while back, on the Virtual Bible Study, we interviewed a Presbyterian preacher from Nashville, and he had just returned from the National Convention of the Presbyterian Churches, and at that convention, they had taken a vote on whether or not they should ordain homosexual ministers in the Presbyterian Church. Actually, he said, unfortunately, it got voted down this time, but we'll get it next time, he said. It was a voting convention. And now, if you challenge anybody on something like that, well, they say, well, they did it. They did it in the first century. They did it in this meeting at Jerusalem. Recorded in Acts 15, mentioned again here in Galatians 2. They went to Jerusalem. They had a convention. They voted on the problem. They decided on an answer. And I really, really think it's important to say no. That is absolutely not what happened. And we have to be ready to prove that. And I think this first phrase here in verse 2 is really important along that line. Paul went up by revelation. He didn't go up by inquiry. He went up by revelation. Thoughts or comments here? Wade?
Yeah, I think back to Acts 15, you see exactly what transpired. They determined, they presented truth based upon the three kinds of criteria that we use today. Paul and Barnabas gave their approved apostolic example of everything that transpired in the Gentiles. James spoke up, quoted scripture, and then necessary inference, he had to infer that this is what was being referred to in Scripture. So that's the way they establish truth, is by God's divine application.
Rules of authority. Exactly right. Exactly right. Monty.
Ultimately, the reason they went to Jerusalem is because the Judaizing teachers came to Jerusalem and said that that's what they were sent to teach. So there was an accusation against the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. So they went to the source of where the problem was perceived to be from, to the rest of their front of us. We were not get approval from the front of us. And these guys said they came from you, so here we are to take it up. Those leaders said, no, that didn't come from us. So it was to get it all worked out. That the false teacher wasn't trying to truth. It was to stop the false teaching in the souls.
Exactly right. And so they just rooting it out at its source. That's exactly right. The reason they went there was not to determine what the truth was, but to stop this false teaching from emanating out of Jerusalem. Tom?
Peter also had that stood up. But my already established a long time ago. Let's go through and look at this, and this is what God promised. So when you go through and look at this study that we looked through the book of Acts, we went through all these things. You had Cornelius converted. Peter had to give a defense of that to those Jews that were there with him, and also the ones back in Jerusalem. And then here he goes. He has to reminds those in Jerusalem there that were listening to this debate with Paul and Barnabas that, well, remember back, we've already discussed this. And then he comes through and he presents that information, and then they come through and they make the decision based on the scriptural evidence there.
I think exactly right. All right. So he says, verse 2, I went up by revelation, communicated to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. Now I have a question for you about this last part of verse 2. But privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. Let me suggest a potential interpretation of what he says there. He said, I went up there, but I talked to the guys of reputation. I talked to the main guys up there, the high-ranking guys, the guys with a significant reputation. But I did it privately because I wanted to make sure that what I was saying was right. You know, I had some doubts in mind, and so I met with them privately to make sure that what I was saying was true. How do you like that interpretation? Wayne? Not so good.
I think the import of that was he didn't want to destroy his reputation among the Gentiles. And he would have run in vain if it could be asserted and it could offer some proof that Paul was really conferring with the apostles and getting what he taught to the Gentiles from them. And so he would have run in vain if it could be proven or assumed that he was just a handicapped apostle.
So he was actually trying to protect his reputation against the accusation that he had learned this from other people.
More than that, his apostleship.
Yeah.
Protect his apostleship.
Yeah. I think also we might add in, I like that explanation very well, and I think also we could add in that, so Paul fears that he will be criticized. Paul's just trying to make a name for himself. Paul's come up here and he's trying to meet with the apostles so that he himself could be regarded as an apostle. So here Paul comes to Jerusalem, and he expects that he should have an audience with the main guys in the church at Jerusalem because he thinks he's so special and he wants everybody else to know how special he is. And so I agree with Wayne that I think the reputation that he was trying to protect was his reputation as an apostle. Again, that he's not dependent upon these others to sign off on his teaching, but he's wanting to make sure that there's no appearance that he's done anything for himself or to further his personal cause. Everybody okay with that, Tom?
So I think when he comes in there, he goes up, talk to them, and we know there's a problem there that's arising in Antioch. But we also go back in Jesus' ministry. There are a lot of people that wouldn't follow Jesus because of the prestige of the Pharisees and things and the high council of the synagogues. People were being put out of the synagogue for following him. Well, here, even in Jerusalem, you had those that were notoriety of in the church and things that might have a bigger voice over the common people that come in and sort of set up a song. Paul comes in and talks to the apostles as well and says, we've got this problem up here in Antioch that has been perpetuated by these leaders that have come up out of Jerusalem. They come here, they probably still have a lot of followers here. We need, that needs to be resolved right now.
So in other words, he wanted to get to the heart of the matter before these false teachers in Jerusalem could stir up a big stink.
That's right.
Okay, I think that probably makes sense too. I think so. All right. So he goes on to describe what took place there, verse 3. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren, unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. All right, some people have suggested, I don't even know, I don't know whether it's true or what you would make of it, but some have suggested that Paul took Titus along as a test case. That here's Titus, a Gentile, and he took Titus along just to see, just to use him as a case study, a case in point. Here's a Gentile man, what about him? That may or may not be the case, I don't know. It's not explained, but it's interesting that Paul does specially note Titus's presence there. He mentioned it in verse 1 and then again in verse 3. Of course, Titus is a Gentile. He's not circumcised. This is going to be this, and so some people are aware of that. How would they be aware of that? Well, I'm not sure, and I wouldn't even want to carefully speculate about how they might know that he was an uncircumcised man. I think they could have just assumed that by virtue of the fact that he's a Gentile. All right. Some have tried to make, and I know, again, I don't want to be too indelicate here, but some have tried to make something out of they came in privily to spy out our liberty, as though they made special effort to verify Titus's uncircumcised state. I don't know that that's the case at all. I think that they were brought in, came in privily. I think that they came into this meeting. I think this is talking more about the meeting that was to be held to discuss these matters. These opponents of Paul, these Judaizing teachers, snuck into the meeting so that they could cause a problem. And the problem they would use as the nexus of their troublemaking was Titus. Here's a case, here's a man exactly like we're talking about. Here's a Gentile man who is uncircumcised, and he must be circumcised if he's going to be a faithful Christian. So I think that's certainly the liberty that they were attacking. And the fact that they were brought in privily, I think probably means to the meeting itself, more so than in a public restroom somewhere or something. I'm not sure they had public restrooms in Jerusalem in that day, probably not. But I think that they snuck into the meeting. But I think this is really interesting. They came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ, that they might bring us to mind. No, to spy out our liberty, that they might bring us into bondage. Well, wait a minute, Paul, you're a Jew. Paul, you're a circumcised man. This doesn't have anything to do with you. This has to do with these Gentile converts. You're a Jew and you're already circumcised. We've got no issue with you. Your situation is not what we're talking about. We're talking about these Gentiles. But notice how Paul frames the issue. It's our liberty. They're trying to bring us into bondage. And so if these false teachers are allowed to prevail, it's going to affect everybody. It's our liberty in Christ. They're trying to put us into bondage. And so Paul sees this as not just, okay, here's these new Gentile converts, we will have to deal with them, but I'm personally detached. I'm over here. I'm among the Jews. This is not an issue for me. It is. When the truth is being attacked, it's an issue for all true believers. When the truth is being attacked, all of us have to be concerned. We can't say, well, that's their problem. They'll just have to deal with it. If it's a matter of truth and righteousness, if it's a matter of doctrinal soundness, it affects us all. And if false doctrine is allowed to prevail, we are all affected by that. And we need to see it that way. Tom?
It goes back into some of the Jewish history too, the concept of Gentiles, and the making of proselytes. So there's a whole process under the Jewish law that someone that wanted to convert to Judaism had to go through a process to have that done. And then the Jews could associate with that proselyte. prior to that, they weren't supposed to have any dealings with them. They were unclean and all this other situation. So you start having some of this Jewish heritage that is coming over into this Christian era, and that's part of the thing that Hebrews was written by, or what Paul's having to deal with that with the Galatians. He deals with it some with the Romans in other writings. So this is a problem all through that. Separation out of Judaism to Christianity was really hard on the basically what we might say these hardcore Jews that were Christians. It just hard for them to
Yeah, it's almost understandable. This has been part and parcel of their lives, and now to say that it's not necessary to observe the law. I think that Paul would argue that if a Jew came to Christ, an uncircumcised Jew didn't need to be circumcised either. Now, I don't think that's the point he's arguing here, but it would be true that circumcision, and we read about it a number of times in the New Testament, circumcision amounts to nothing now. It's not required under the law of Christ. And anybody who does try to require that is binding where the law doesn't bind. And that's the big issue. When you try to enforce something that cannot be proven by revelation, if you're trying to force something or include something or add something or delete something, and it's not true to the Word, then that's the issue. And that's what was going on here. We're so far removed from the circumcision controversy, that's just not an issue for us. But the concept under discussion here is so important. The concept of standing for the truth and not allowing anybody to change it, that is critically important. In verse 5, and we reference verse 5 pretty often. I think it's such an important verse. Verse 5, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue. Well, this is a matter of truth. And since it is a matter of truth, we are not going to submit, not for an hour. We're not going to give any place to that. We gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour. Why? Because of the truth of the gospel, that the truth of the gospel continue with you. I think that's the way we've got to be. Paul's attitude was not, well, we're just going to have to get along and go along just for the sake of peace and harmony. I don't agree with these guys, Paul says. In fact, I know better. I know that what they're saying is not true. But, this is going to cause a lot of trouble. And if we just don't just sort of yield on this and compromise a little bit, it's going to be a big deal. It's going to cause a lot of trouble. And I think we just need to kind of get along and go along. Absolutely not, right? No, not for an hour. No, not for an hour. Why? Because of the truth of the gospel. That the truth of the gospel might continue with you. All right, now, and I think verse 5 is so important there, and we need to really honor that notion. John?
I was just going to say, one of the overarching things that we got to remember, first of all, is that Paul is an apostle. So the truth has been revealed to him.
He knew it before he went there.
He has the truth.
Yeah.
And in verse 2, it said he went up to get the revelation and set before them. He set the law before them. He didn't sit before them and ask permission. He set the law.
Yeah, he wasn't asking their permission to teach what he said.
And then, he says, he goes further on. He says, we didn't even come home to it. Why? Because he already knew the truth. He had to go there and make sure that they were set straight, not that he was set straight.
I think that's it.
That has to be our attitude. When we're looking at the scriptures, we're faced with false doctrine, we're faced with false teaching. We have to remember, this is sound. Not what you're hearing, but what you're hearing is about this, and you know it's false.
I think you're right. I think you're exactly right. I got a question for you now. So here's Titus, and they come to Jerusalem, and there's this big blow up about Titus. Titus is an uncircumcised man. You're going to have to circumcise Titus. No, not for an hour, Paul said. We gave place by subjection. No, not for an hour. On the circumcision question in general, and on Titus in particular, we would not submit to them about that. Okay? All right, now let's go to Acts 16 for a minute. And I think it's interesting that this comes right on the heels of of this meeting in Jerusalem. The meeting in Jerusalem is recorded in Acts 15. And in Acts 16, on the second missionary journey, when Paul came to Derbe and Lystra, Acts 16:1, then came he, Paul, to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. Him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Oh, now wait a minute. Paul in Jerusalem had just said, no, not for now. We're not submitting to that. Titus is not going to be circumcised. You're not going to put that over on us. We are not going to yield on this question in general. We're not going to yield on Titus in particular. We're not putting up that. No, not for an hour. Then not that long after that, he goes off on his second missionary journey, and he comes to a place, and there's this young disciple, Timotheus. Paul wants him to join this traveling company. And he says, he took and circumcised him, chapter 16, verse 3. He took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. How are you going to explain that? Monty?
Titus being a Gentile would have been allowed in the synagogues, just like he would have been allowed in the temple. But Timothy, being a Jewish descent, could go into these places with all the government teaching that was going on. So in order to accomplish that, they done that as an expedient to be able to not be divisive to the audience that they were going. Paul talked about how he became all things to all men. When he was in Jewish company, he was Jewish customs. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't wrong to do most of those things. But he could do that. When he was the Gentiles teaching, then he would do all the work of the Gentiles. So he didn't have, in order not to be offensive to the Jews in the places he was going, where he went to the Jewish synagogues first. He'd go there first on the Sabbath, teach them, and then after that then he would teach the Gentiles. So right, in order for Timothy to be able to be in and help in that work, he did this as an expedient to the work, not as a religious for the law.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. Wade?
I think that we have to realize too that there are some things that are not sinful to do. Like, let me just give an example. I think probably predominant most people now are circumcised. Are we circumcised for a religious rite? No. But we are circumcised. So, to get circumcised, there's nothing wrong with it. Certainly, you can't sin.
The physical act is not a sin. Yeah, that's what you're saying.
And so, for Paul to say, I don't want to have to deal with this issue, and I'm just going to go in, it's like going to God and say, give me blood to begin with, then I don't have to deal with this. I think that's probably just to avoid the controversy, just go ahead and do it. And he knew that Timothy was a Jew, so he had the right to do it.
Okay, so you used the word judgment. Monty used the word expedient. I think that's what we got here. Wayne?
Much like I think in Acts 21, where James says, you're really developing a bad reputation among the Jews here. What I think would be a good idea is for you to go down and take these men, have them pay for their have them pay for
Rites
their
of purification, yeah.
Yeah, purification vow. And go in with them, and that way the Jews will see that you're not contrary to the law, that you're not against the law. You're not a traitor, as they would have branded him.
Yeah.
But in doing so, he could have Timothy circumcised, Titus not circumcised, and it would still not affect his relationship with the Gentiles.
Yeah. I think you guys are right on it. This was a judgment call. So if he didn't do this, as Monty said, every place they went, and every time they tried to engage, this was going to be brought up. Timothy would have been precluded from some situations because of being uncircumcised. Just to take that off the table so it wasn't an issue to be fought in every city he went to, he made a judgment call. Notice in this, there's a couple significant differences here between Titus and Timothy. In the case of Titus, he was a Gentile. And in the case of Titus, these Judaizing teachers were trying to force and bind their law. In the case of Timothy, he was at least half Jewish, and there doesn't seem to be anybody here who's trying to force Paul's hand on this. There doesn't seem anybody here who's saying, Timothy must be circumcised or else. It doesn't seem he's not dealing with those people in this context in Acts 16. So I think those two differences stand. And the bottom line is that Paul saw this as a proper judgment in the case of Timothy, but absolutely not in the case of Titus, because they were trying to bind that as law. Are we all good on that? Okay. All right. So let's go just a little bit further here. He says in verse 6, but of these who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me, God accepteth no man's person. For they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised was committed unto me, as the gospel of circumcision was unto Peter, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. All right. So here was the outcome of the meeting in Jerusalem. Now, this is obviously the Cliff Note version of what happened in Jerusalem. Acts 15 is the far more thorough dealing with the meeting that took place in Jerusalem. But the outcome is stated here. I thought it was interesting. Verse 6, again, this really needs to be emphasized about this meeting in Jerusalem. These who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. So, again, Paul is saying this wasn't a decision-making meeting. We didn't take a vote. They didn't change or alter anything that I knew and believed to be true before I went there, because what I knew was from revelation from the Lord. So he again says, and so I would really stress this, because I don't know if you all have run into, as I have, but more than once I've run into people who want to use this Acts 15, which is the reference here in our study in Galatians 2, but they want to use that Acts 15 meeting as a religious convention, a conference, a voting situation to decide a doctrinal issue. And it absolutely was not that. I just can't stress that enough. Those who would use it that way are seriously misusing Acts 15. And I think Galatians 2 really proves that. So he said, they didn't add anything to me. In conference, they added nothing to me. They didn't give me any information I didn't already know. Instead, he says, the outcome was when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed to me as the gospel of the circumcision was to Peter. And then he expands upon that. For he that wrought effectually in Peter the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. I got a question for you now. I don't know how many of you were able to listen to the virtual Bible study, not this week, but the previous week when we interviewed a Baptist preacher from Illinois. There's this concept that is called dispensationalism. When we hear the word dispensation, we think of the patriarchal dispensation, the Mosaic dispensation, the Christian dispensation. We think about periods of time. A dispensation is how things are being dispensed, how things are being handed out, how things are being delivered. And so what we use that word dispensation. In the patriarchal dispensation, God gave His law to the patriarchs. In the Mosaic dispensation, He gave His law to Moses. In the Christian dispensation, we serve under the law of Christ. So the law of God is dispensed. In the Bible, we read about those three different time periods when the law of God was being dispensed in those different ways. We understand. These people who believe in dispensationalism are not talking about that. What they're talking about is that when the gospel began to be preached, there was a dispensation to Peter. Peter was given a gospel to preach to the Jews. And there was a different gospel given to Paul to preach to the Gentiles. And so there were two different dispensations of the gospel. And two different gospels, effectively. One, a gospel that Peter preached to the Jews, and a different gospel that Paul preached to the Gentiles. Now, if you dig deep into that, those modern day dispensationalists. By the way, I don't know if any of you ever seen or have had or know of the Schofield Study Bible. That was fairly popular a while back. I don't hear too many people referencing it, but you may find an old one at a garage sale or something somewhere. The Schofield Study Bible, of course, it's the scripture text, but then it's the study notes that have been added. And the Schofield Study Bible teaches this notion of dispensationalism. Peter taught a gospel to the Jews. Paul taught a different gospel to the Gentiles. It's not true. But when you dig into that, one of the differences was circumcision, they claim. But another difference that they want to say is Peter preached baptism for the remission of sins to the Jews. Paul never taught baptism for the remission of sins to the Gentiles. So it actually comes to home, right? This affects us because it's not just the circumcision question. It's a question about something as fundamental as baptism. And these modern day dispensationalists say that Paul never taught the Gentiles that they had to be baptized. Matt?
That kind of brings to mind, to me, my first thought is, the keys of the kingdom given Peter. When you have keys, what do? You open something up. You give the keys authority to open up the kingdom, preach the gospel to the Jews first. And then later, he was the first one to preach the gospel to Cornelius and open up the kingdom to the Gentiles. The message was the same. Both included baptism, that they all had to be baptized. So that in fact would not be true because Peter preached both and preached the same message.
Exactly right. So Peter certainly taught the Jews on Pentecost to be baptized. But as you say in Acts 10, when he went to the house of Cornelius, the first Gentile convert, he taught Cornelius to be baptized. So where's the difference? And in the case of Paul, we know that he did teach the Gentiles to be baptized. What did he do in Philippi? What did he do with the Philippian jailer in Acts chapter 16? He took the great risk of being out of the prison in the middle of the night to baptize the Philippian jailer and his family in the same hour of the night. So who can honestly say that they taught a different gospel? It doesn't make sense. Just a sort of a crazy side note on that. So when I was studying with a couple of these guys sometime back, several years ago in fact, they said, well, Peter and Paul taught a different gospel, but in order to really get the gist of what Paul taught, you have to go to his later epistles. Sure, he did. Initially, Paul did baptize some Gentiles, but later on, when he got this thing cleared in his mind, later on he did not preach baptism to the Gentiles. And so here's their arbitrary rule. If you're going to prove that Paul taught baptism to the Gentiles, you got to use the later epistles of Paul, specifically his prison epistles. We just studied the prison epistles, remember, on our Wednesday night class? If you're going to prove that Paul taught baptism to the Gentiles, you have to use just the prison epistle. Well, man, that's an arbitrary rule, isn't it? Who gets to set rules like that? But actually, there is a place in the prison epistles where Paul taught Gentiles to be baptized. Look at Ephesians 5, verse 25. Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives even as Christ also loved the church, gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word. There's baptism, right? In a prison epistle, there's Paul talking about baptism, the washing of water by the word. That's baptism. Water baptism for the remission of sins. And so, that's a phony distinction. Peter to the Jews, Paul to the Gentiles. It's not true. Wait.
Yeah, there's a couple points I wanted to make. So in Ephesians 4 there, in verse 4, it says there's one body, one spirit, just as you were called in the hope of your, one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. So that kind of dispels that whole point that they're different. Now I do know in the Old Testament, though, that the Jews were taught a little different, I think, than probably the Gentiles. I know that Jonah was dispatched to go to the Gentiles to teach, but God's people were the Jews, and so they were treated a little differently than the Gentiles were treated in that era. But as far as the Christian dispensation, I don't think there's any difference.
That's the key. That's the key, yeah. Certainly there was a distinction between Jew and Gentile in Old Testament times, but not now. And that middle wall, Paul said the middle wall distinction has been brought down. There's no distinction. They're neither Jew nor Greek. He says in Galatians 3:27, 28. Monty.
In Galatians 1 and verse 6, Paul's talking about a different gospel and another gospel. In verse 8, he said, but if we are an angel of heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we've already preached to you, let him be accursed. So this idea that he taught one thing and then it progressed later and became another, he's saying if anybody teaches you differently than what I have,
I think that's a good point. If he was teaching baptism before and then later was not teaching it, he changed it. That's a good point.
Well, the audience there that baptism is the circumcision is made without hands. So what the physical circumcision was to the Jew, the spiritual circumcision is to the Gentile.
Yeah.
It is the sign. It is what puts one in a relationship with God.
Yeah.
A relationship with God. So very clearly, he taught that throughout his whole life.
I think you're exactly right. Now, so what about what he says there in verse 7? The gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me as the gospel of the circumcision was to Peter. He's not talking about different gospels. He's just talking about the emphasis of their work. The emphasis of Peter's work would be toward Jews, but it wasn't exclusively, right? Because Peter did go to Gentiles. And Paul's work would have the focus and emphasis of going to the Gentiles, but not exclusively, because we know he did teach Jews everywhere he went. So he's just saying that the emphasis of they're acknowledging that they had been given by God jobs to do. And Peter's focus would be on the Jews and Paul's would be on the Gentiles. I think that's all they're saying, Wayne.
Also, what he's saying is just as Peter is just as Peter was the apostle to the Gentile or to the Jew, Paul had the same status as an apostle. So he was not in any way inferior to what the Jews considered the most preeminent apostle.
Right.
That he had the same relationship apostolically as the apostle Peter did.
I think you're exactly right. Mom?
later on in this chapter 2 of Galatians, in verse 11, it starts talking about where he withstood Peter's place, because he was making a distinction between the way he worked or behaved or dealt with Jewish Christians
Right.
and Gentile Christians, and told him he was wrong to do that. And so, and he done that publicly to his face. So if there was a different gospel from one another, then Peter would have been doing the right thing, but he pointed out his error and made him repent.
I think you're right. So real quickly, he says, when James and Cephas and John, verse 9, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me. Notice it was a grace, something bestowed by God to Paul, this job to take the gospel to the Gentiles. When they perceived that grace that was given to me and Barnabas, they extended the right hand of fellowship that we should go to the heathen, they to the circumcision. Only And Paul said, we did this anyway. They just encouraged us that we should remember the poor. And we've always been inclined to do that, he said. And so that was the basic outcome of the meeting in Jerusalem. And the problem was not decided there, but the problem was solved there because you had Peter and John and James and everybody else in Jerusalem who knew what was right. They basically endorsed Paul. The outcome of the meeting at Jerusalem was Paul's work among the Gentiles was not, he didn't get them to approve him in the sense that he needed their stamp of approval. But what he did get them to do was to acknowledge that what he was teaching among the Gentiles was the truth of God. And that was really important. All right. As Monty mentioned just a minute ago, start at verse 11. This problem is not over completely because we got Peter acting out here in the last half of chapter 2, and we'll address that next week, Lord willing.